something that's happening really on a massive global scale. If we're talking about coronavirus, it has touched people from the top echelons of society to the bottom. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't, only touch the poor countries or rich countries. It's really going everywhere. So in that sense, it doesn't feel unique. But what does feel unique about it from a Middle Eastern context is that it's just something that, just kind of is, I feel, is aggravating and highlighting things that we, as, whether as the societies themselves in those countries or in the West, were kind of trying to sweep under the rug and not pay much attention to, So
Right.
all of these, like, if you look at the ways, for example, that, Iran has dealt with this, Iraq, Egypt, even Lebanon, Syria, these systematic weaknesses that have been a part of that society for so long are now being aggravated by this virus. And in terms of how those countries are dealing with it, in a country like Lebanon, where you have this completely parallel governance system, between Hezbollah, a state within a state, what does that do to a country trying to contain the crisis? Same for Iraq. Same for Iran being just a completely authoritarian regime, or Egypt, or any of the other Arab countries. What does that do? And are those types of governance systems sustainable for the kinds of challenges that we're going to be facing moving forward?
Right. But let me ask you about at least the recent political demands that we saw on the streets, these chants for change, at times outright regime change. In particular in Lebanon, beginning October 17, going through until just a few weeks ago. Do you sense that the coronavirus pandemic may ultimately end the political aspirations that we saw the past few months? Or in a sense, is it just a pause in that momentum, that eventually these are demands that will have to be dealt with in one form or another?
I definitely, and of course I have to caveat this by saying I'm not Lebanese, but I lived there for a year and a half before I left, and of course continue to stay in very close touch with friends there. And I would definitely say that this is not something, the aspirations that were so vocalized by people in Lebanon of every age, every faith, every sect, every city in the country, is not something that just goes away because people are scared of a pandemic.
Right.
And I think if there's anything that we've learned from the Middle East in the last, there was like sort of the first, what we called the Arab Spring, the revolutions that toppled Hosni Mubarak and protest revolutions in Tunisia and Libya and other countries. And then fast forward several years later, and then you have another round of protests, and maybe they weren't about the same thing exactly, but they were all kind of connected in the sense that you had people out in the streets demanding dignity. And It really all boils down to dignity, right? It's someone who wants to be able to go home at the end of the day and look his kids in the eye and look his wife in the eye, or a wife to look at, her husband or her parents or whatever. To have people be able to come home at the end of the day holding their head up high and saying, we are living a dignified life. That demand doesn't go away. It doesn't go away because of oppression, because of repression by a government. It doesn't go away because of foreign intervention or the lack thereof. And it certainly won't go away because of a pandemic, as horrible as it might be. And as much as it sort of stops life for a while, those kinds of demands just don't go away.
So what I'm getting from you is, in a way, even if the numbers are not there for a while, whether the protests on the street maybe the protesters have gone home, that the fact is, because their demands have been unfulfilled, it's just a matter of time until they seek change once again. That this is just a hiatus from what we saw happening.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if anything, some of the demands are going to get even more
Right.
urgent. I mean,
Right.
you know, I mean, so I'll tell you just a very quick story just to illustrate, you know, what I'm talking about. So when I used to live in Lebanon, I had this driver that I used to hire for most of my daily outings, routines. I always made sure that if I had any friends coming into the country, that they would call him, that he was going to be their driver. Really, really good guy, really hardworking,
Yeah.
but just kind of your typical struggling guy. You know, he had a wife and 3 kids. His daughter has had heart problems, seizures, just kind of one bout of bad luck after the other.
Mm.
And just always running around to make ends meet, and really just working hard, like waking up and working hard every day, doing everything right.
Yeah.
And you know, when the protest started last year, he couldn't drive because, I mean, he's a driver. Like, the roads were closed, there were road closures, tires burning,
Yeah.
no tourists, and so he was in a really bad spot. So he reached out to me, which must have been very difficult for him, just from a pride point of view.
Were
He
you
asked me to.
you were not in Lebanon at the time? You were,
No, I had moved away by that
right. Yeah.
point.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
he basically, but at that point, he had fallen behind on his rent and
Yeah.
and the rent for his car as well, which, if he doesn't have a car, then he can't
Sure.
drive, then he can't bring home an income.
Yeah.
And so I ended up doing a fundraiser for him on Twitter and Facebook, and I was just really, it was so heartwarming to see how generous complete strangers were. I mean, we ended up raising $3,000 for him,
Oh,
which,
wow.
yeah, which covered his rent for his car and his house that he owed to other people.
Right.
And he was he was blown away. I mean, he was like, I can't believe random strangers were donating $5 up to $400 for someone
Yeah.
that they've never met. Anyway, it's like just a little side story about the beauty of the human spirit. But he, you know, he got back to kind of zero balance.
Yes.
And then he got hit by one crisis after the other. Then the banks weren't releasing funds. Then he couldn't do this. Then he couldn't do that. And now with coronavirus again. And so, you know, when this is all over, he is going to be someone who needs help from his government.
Yeah.
He's going to need support from his government to get his life back in order. He has an expectation now that his government is going to come to his aid in his time of deepest need. And if you multiply that by all of, you know, most of Lebanese society, they're going to come back out of this and look at their government and say, okay, how are you going to help us deal with this?
But is there any risk there in terms of for what you're saying, which is a return to normalcy to a degree, at least economic dignity? So you have some money to rely on and there's some level of security. Is there any hesitation that may ultimately prevent people from pushing the envelope again and trying to seek political change? In other words, that a comfort zone may return, where it's a familiar beast, something we've dealt with for a long time. The old order does offer just enough to get by. Maybe it's not the right time to risk change.
You know, so that's a really interesting question. And it really depends, I think, on Lebanese society itself. Because, you know, for example, when I remember, because I was there for the first few days of the protests, and then I was kind of monitoring through friends from afar.
Mm-hmm.
And you could definitely see after the first couple of months, maybe 3 months, I started seeing a sort of separation, a sort of tension between the younger generation, the very idealistic generation, the ones who, you know, quite frankly, are still living with their parents, you know, and maybe don't have to worry about bringing home, you know, bread for their family. So they were pushing the envelope. They're, no, we're not going home. We're not going home until this is over. And then you started to see people like Ali, the driver, who was like, all right, listen, I'm with you and everything, but I can't drive because you're blocking the roads and I need to feed my family.
Right.
You know, why don't we just accept whatever the government has to offer and, like, let's call it a day.
Right.
And so I think that we're going to start to see that tension within society, where you have kind of the younger generation, the older generation the people who have not so much to lose versus the people who have lots to lose.
Right.
And, Lebanon, for example, just Egypt, where my parents are from, they're very different countries, Lebanon and Egypt. But we saw the same thing in Egypt as well, where today, although this is changing a bit too, but generally speaking, you had this moment, recently in the last couple of years, I would say, where people are kind of like, look, we don't want, they're looking around the region and they're seeing Syria in just complete tatters, Iraq in complete despair, Libya, and they're just looking around and they're saying like, gosh, we don't want that.
Right.
And starting to make those calculations in their heads, do we just kind of keep our heads down and just take what we can, or do we risk it all and risk being like those countries? And
Right.
it's definitely a fear that is being capitalized on by some leaders in the region.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, look, you don't want to be like the Syrians, do you? And people are like, well, actually, we really don't. I mean, we don't want to, So, where that goes and where that balance kind of ends up shaking out at the end of the day, I think what the coronavirus crisis is showing us is that at the same time that it's illuminating all of these weaknesses in certain countries, like in Lebanon, can you really have a sustainable system where there's a state within a state? In Syria, can you really have a sustainable system where a non-state actor is governing large swaths of territory in the north of Syria, for example?
Right.
So you have all these questions that are coming up. But the other side of that is it's also potentially making authoritarianism attractive in a way compared to that. So you have, you're looking at countries like the Gulf countries who have tested more citizens than any other country in the region. They're implementing measures that are maybe harder to implement in other countries.
Right.
And so you might have people starting to think, and this is a global conversation now,
Absolutely.
but it's definitely happening in the region as well, where you're like, look, at the end of the day, the world is awful. We have all these problems. Do we really want to risk it for democracy, or do we just is authoritarianism the way to go? We swallow our pride a little bit and we move on.
Hints of this even in the EU, with Hungary becoming a quasi-dictatorship. I mean, this is not it doesn't speak well for democratic aspirations at the moment.
Right. And I was just actually talking about this, funny enough, with a Lebanese friend yesterday, where we were saying, what do you think the world is going to look like after this? Are we just going to accept, so let's say between now and then, our lives are going to have to be a little bit more controlled by government. Government's going to have to know a little bit more about us than we might be comfortable with, and it's and in different countries, of course, they're going to take it to different lengths. Like you just mentioned, Hungary. Are we going to become complacent and accept that as the new normal? Or by the time that becomes the new normal, are we even going to have the chance to reverse it, even if we wanted to?
Right.
Are we going to want to reverse it? And all of these, I mean, I think it's too early to tell, but if people aren't thinking about these questions, they definitely should be right now, because the last thing we want is to wake up, especially in a region like the Middle East, where we already have had problems with authoritarianism and like the lack of control over our own lives.
Right.
We need to be asking ourselves these questions and kind of preparing ourselves for, quote unquote, the day after.
Look back 100 years ago, the geopolitical situation was a mess in the Middle East. Right? Spanish flu, hundreds of thousands, millions of people died. And in the middle of that, you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing. You have World War I. And suddenly the Middle East finds itself in a very different situation. And I know that this is not exactly what is happening today, but I just wondered that it's because social distancing is such a strong component in how to solve this coronavirus. It's just hard to see the same drive by the youth to accelerate the necessary changes that all of us have been speaking of for decades now. And that I worry that if there's no if that momentum stutters, or let's say the pause is too long, that it may be years and years from now before we see that sort of rush to alleviate the pain and the what you said earlier, the dignity, wanting to
Of
reclaim.
course.
Yeah.
Of course. And it's just one of those things that, I mean, what else do you do? I mean, the fact is that, some of these governments are going to use this crisis to their advantage.
Yes.
Like they can institute lockdowns, for example, and
Yeah.
by virtue of being locked down, you can't go out and protest. And who knows how
Sure.
long that will take.
Let alone even organize. I mean, even meet beyond.
Let alone even meet. I mean, different countries have different, I mean, even something like travel, like you don't really think about right now, everybody's kind of frustrated. Like, we can't travel, we can't go to be reunited with our loved ones, we can't go visit family, we can't do this and that. But there's also a second and third order effects of that, which is you're also not having any international conferences where people are getting to meet and exchange ideas and get moral support and bring that back to their countries and move it forward. You're not having training sessions, you're not having workshops. I mean, all of that has stopped, and that's going to have a hugely detrimental effect. Absolutely. That nobody's mentioned that. I haven't heard anybody mention that before. I only just actually thought of it now as we were talking.
I had an economic advisor reached out to me. I thought he wanted to be interviewed. Turns out he wanted the know-how of how to set up a podcast, because their international conference is canceled and they wanted to put it online. And I felt it's really speaks to the moment that they want to find a way to do this, but the limitations are so severe that technology is the substitute. But technology is not enough just to push through regime change. It really requires human momentum on the street, or at least some level of organization that's physical.
Of course.
Yeah.
You remember, so this was a long time ago now, but in the Egyptian revolution of 2011, when the Egyptian government at the time, if you'll remember, there was a very critical moment. And of course, we'll never know exactly how much this factored into everything and what would have happened if they hadn't done this. But they shut down the internet.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Of course.
But you know what that did? That forced people out into the streets to communicate, and that 100%. Created that human momentum that you're talking about.
Yes.
That, so of course, when you look back here, you kind of think like, wow, like if they hadn't cut off the internet, would this have happened? It's all these little tiny moments that you think back on and you think, wow. So, this was a life-changing event, and it had so many ripple effects. But you're right. Everything happens now. I mean, technology is such a huge part of our lives now, and we do use it in a way that we've never used. It's an integral part of our lives. I mean, where would we be right now during in isolation if we couldn't Zoom and Skype and WhatsApp and all of that stuff? But you're right, it's not enough. But when are we able to get back onto the streets and congregate? When are we able to go have sessions where we could talk about our aspirations and how best to go about them? When are we able to go out into the street and demand better things of our governments? Yeah. I mean, we don't know.
It's a very it's an unexpected pause in all the developments we've been seeing for the last months, even years. It's just sort of a moment of reckoning. And I guess, I mean, at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. It's too soon to predict how these things play out. Mm-hmm. It's clear at the end of the day, though, that if these aspirations are not fulfilled, they will be called on once again. That won't just simply fade away.
100%. So that's actually exactly what I was about to say. Mm-hmm. I was going to say that I agree with you, and basically to say that, for governments in the region that have been struggling with how to, address their people's demands. Yes. Some governments have decided they're not going to address the demands. We're just going to clamp down, and this is the way things are going to be. Yeah. And you just kind of hope that you clamp down enough that no one can do anything. And we can also, I mean, and of course, those governments are doing so with the support, with the kind of tacit, so if not support, then at least feigned ignorance of the West as well, and we can talk about that,
Yes.
later. Like how differently the West is reacting to the region now, and what role that's played in everything that we're talking about. But for governments that have not decided on to go like the full authoritarian route. So, for example, the Lebanese government, that they have basically been granted a sort of like a little pause, a little respite to figure stuff out,
Yes.
And if I were advising those governments, I would say, look, you have basically gotten an extension on your grad school paper that was due 2 weeks ago. And instead of just procrastinating even further, write that paper, use the time to write the paper so that when this is all over, you can just hand it in.
Are you speaking from personal experience here, that this is
100%? I'm the worst. But you really want to tell these governments to if there's anything that the last 10-15 years have taught us, it's that people's aspirations are not going to go away. People will not live a life where they feel there's a word in Arabic, mazlul, and humiliated, I think, is the closest word. People don't take well to living under, to living a life of humiliation for a long time. Right. And these governments now have an opportunity to take a step back and figure out how they're going to fix this. Yes. And I hope that they do that.
You're the perfect person, and this is actually the perfect segue, which I always enjoy. You've sort of made it magically happen. You're both, I'll say this carefully here, you're young enough so that you're not too jaded from the region, and right. You're also old enough to have seen at least shades of attempts at reform and change. And you have personally been part of the story to a degree, at least when it comes to American involvement in the region. And I'm going to ask you just to take me back a bit to the years leading up to the Iraq invasion in 2003 and the aftermath of that invasion, the US occupation and the whole story that we're familiar with. American interest when it comes to the day-to-day affairs of the average person living in that part of the world, in my eyes, seems to be far less, that there's a reluctance today.
Today, yes.
Today. Go back in time 15 years ago, 16 years ago, that it seemed like that's the whole discussion was on the aspirations of the average person. Maybe for reasons that we don't need to get into in that endless debate of why the invasion happened. But that aside, the outcome of these protest movements, and I hope I say this right, would have been a priority for American policymakers and the US government in those years, 15 years ago. And today it's hard to find it. It's really hard to see a curiosity and the genuine desire for democracy and dignity and economic reform, political reform, all that. And I know there's a lot that happened in between. I know it's a completely different administration today than, let alone forget the Bush years, than the Obama years too. This administration stands out. And I know that Americans in the Middle East today are it's a different story, and it's one that obviously many consequences along the way. But is there, in your opinion, is there room today for American involvement, at least when it comes to the aspirations of protesters? Is there anything that the Americans can do today that they're not doing? And is there any sort of lessons learned from the last 15 years of what we've seen happen in the Middle East? And I hope I'm saying this right, American reluctance.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I feel like I could talk about that for hours and hours, but I know we don't have that much time. I guess I'll just say a couple of things. So I think, my experience with sort of U.S. involvement in the region starts in 2003, in early 2003. Very inadvertently, when I as a very young woman, I volunteered to be a translator with U.S. troops going into Iraq. And, I was 21 and I don't think I really understood full well what I was signing up for. But the reason I did was because, I just felt like I had an obligation as someone who was bicultural and bilingual
Right.
to do my part, to enhance and sort of allow for proper communication between the two sides. Because
Yes.
I mean, this too, Ronnie, like, when you grow up sort of in between different cultures, you really, really start placing a lot of importance on communication. You know that communication is everything. The wrong word, the wrong look, can lead to misunderstandings. And if you can't communicate that properly, bad things can happen. So that's why I went. But the reason I bring that up is because, I got to see really firsthand and very closely what U.S. involvement in the Middle East looked like, and what the dynamic was between sort of Americans and Iraqis at the time. Of course, later on, I started working at the Pentagon, and I was there for 8 years. And so I participated in U.S. foreign policy towards the region from a very much higher level, a policy
Right.
perspective, whereas in Iraq, I was on the ground. And it was sort of amazing and kind of sad to see I don't want to say evolution, because I think it was just a devolving trajectory, and when it came to that relationship. And
Yeah.
there are a couple of reasons for that, I think, right? Like, one reason is, and I think this had a large part to do with it, which is you simply had, 3 U.S. presidents consecutively who had utterly different visions for the region.
Yeah.
Utterly. I mean, you had George W. Bush, who was all about, I think his administration genuinely did believe, at a certain level, that they wanted to empower the people of the region and sow democracy and all this, but they didn't really, I don't think, understand the full implications of that, and I think you'll remember, was it 2005 when Hamas won elections, sort of free and fair? Was it 2005, I think?
Either 5 or maybe 2006. It's around then. Yeah.
Right, but the U.S. didn't acknowledge the results of those elections. So there was just sort of that kind of fumbling around with what we thought we wanted for the region, and what that would have looked like in real life, and how unprepared we were to accept what that would have looked like in real life.
Right.
Then you had President Obama come in, who really just wanted to reset. He just wanted to do away with all of the Bush era policies and start from scratch. And he initially came in with a very, I think, human view of the region. I think partly because he grew up in Indonesia, he was familiar with Muslim culture. Obviously not that the whole Middle East is Muslim, but he was a little bit more understanding of that, and I think more humanizing in the way that he saw the region. Unfortunately, I think that he kind of had to deal with, the Arab Spring and Libya and Syria, and getting re-involved in Iraq when he really didn't want to, and ISIS, and he was just kind of, and I think, and I sort of speak from firsthand knowledge here, or at least from being in government and kind of seeing this, that there was a moment, and I can't pinpoint that moment, but there was a time, when I think President Obama kind of, said, look, you can't change this region. You can't do anything. These people are kind of good. They're going to do whatever they're going to do. And it was, I struggled with it, because I could see why he would think that, but I also found it deeply frustrating and disappointing that we started to lose our humanity and our sort of humanization of the people of the Middle East. We started really looking at.
You were in the Pentagon then. You sort of, this is from, I mean, okay, I'm going to just interrupt for a moment. This is a fairly short period of time that passes. I mean, this is, I'm guessing, 7 or 8 years after.
8 years.
8 years. So it's really, the attention span is quite short when it comes to kind of.
Well, but I'll tell you why it's quite short, and this is like what I learned at the Pentagon too. So I only worked under President Obama. So I worked for the 8 years under his, roughly under his administration. And, one thing that I learned, and it was also kind of simultaneously enlightening and disappointing at the same time. So I worked on, crisis portfolios, Lebanon, Syria, I did, some on Egypt, Jordan, and so on. ISIS, for me, as well as like my many colleagues who worked on Syria for years, it's just something that was deeply scarring and something that we will never be able to forget, because you're so invested and you're so, in your mind, you want to write a memo to the US president and say, sir, we have to get involved in Syria. We have to do something. Meanwhile, though, the president has a million memos on his desk that are talking about the rise of China and Russia, a resurgent Russia, and climate change. And, and so, you're the US president and you're trying to prioritize, and maybe you won't do something in Syria because you think that you have to do something about Russia and China and so on. And so if anything, it helped me understand sort of the decision-making capability, or the decision-making process of a U.S. president. But I also, I also think that it wasn't just that. I think it was like the vast array of challenges that, the Obama administration had to deal with, combined with the fact that there was just extreme fatigue on the part of the U.S. in just dealing with the Middle East. It was sort of like, all right, well, we can't change anything, So the Arab Spring started, the Obama administration was totally caught off guard in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia and Syria and in Bahrain, and with every country we had to figure out, okay, what do we do? What's our position? Is there anything we can do to shape this? Should we even be doing anything to shape this? So there was a lot of kind of back and forth, and there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of trial and error. You had people who were his cabinet was very mixed. You had the sort of humanitarian interventionists like Samantha Power. You had the sort of more hawkish people like Hillary Clinton. You had the Pentagon that was sort of always like, no, we're not going to suspend arms shipments to so-and-so regime because we need them on our side. So there was a lot of back and forth. When you went to the when Trump got elected, you had for the second, so you had, first you had Obama trying to override whatever
the Bush
president, his predecessor did. Now you had another president who was trying to override what his predecessor did. So it was all about dismantling anything and everything that the Obama administration has done, with an even more tired American public of the Middle East, with an even more disinterested and non-empathetic person in the presidency. So President Trump doesn't care about the region. He really genuinely sees it, I think, in two ways. He's in two categories. You have like the cash cows, you have the countries that you can get money out of, like i.e. the Gulf, and you have the countries that are problems like Iran and Syria.
Is it simply a matter of personality here, that the leadership is not interested? And add to that perhaps there isn't someone to talk to there in the Middle East, that that these are aspirations, and they're maybe well-intentioned and they're calling on the things that resonate, but if there's no one to talk to per se, it's a hopeless cause. So in other words, I'm going to maybe give two examples. The Arab Spring, which is, if you look back on it, that's the closest the Middle East got to something familiar to the West. 1989, the Berlin Wall falling, and then this sort of Velvet Revolution, Romania, Poland, all of that, this spring, this awakening, it should resonate through and through. And you have an administration that is largely reluctant, and part of that is simply a president who is elected to make sure that there's no further involvement in that part of the world. So that really comes down to, it's almost like a blending of personality and policy, and the two are not lining up when it comes to helping, reluctantly getting involved. You fast forward a decade later, this is even more so. This is genuine accountability. These are domestic uprisings. Very little geopolitical thought to it. when geopolitics gets in, it gets in for the usual reasons, but not when it comes to protesters. They're not waving flags. They're not calling on external powers to come to their rescue. In a way, this is really a really unique moment. It's domestic, and it's simple accountability. And there's no interest. And people are left, just deal with it on your, if you can do it, good for you. If you can't, it doesn't matter to us meaning the Americans.
Right.
And
and even the Europeans too, Ronnie. I mean, the Europeans have been completely absent from all of this as well.
Oh, and I actually, for better or worse, when I say Americans, I should also, I mean, the players that could get involved.
The big right. The UK, France, Germany, yeah.
The ones
the US.
that you usually expect to be on your side when you're calling on positive change at
exactly
home, and they're not there. And here you have really, this is a fluid moment, protesters without leadership, without names that are familiar. It's not like these are political parties that are sort of summoning the leadership. On the contrary, protesters fluid without leadership, and a president in the White House who seems, as you said, to be really just, this is just nothing to do with us for at least, yeah.
Right. So okay. So if we're talking about Lebanon specifically right now, something that you mentioned is really important, which was that the Lebanese protests that erupted late last year, it's a leaderless movement.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that my Lebanese friends have been extremely proud of. You know, it's a people's movement.
Yes.
It's decentralized, it's democratic, it's widespread. You know, it's I was there. I mean, I was walking around and I had goosebumps, you know. I was walking around and, you know, people were singing, and for the first time, all I saw around me was the Lebanese flag. No party flags.
Absolutely.
I mean, so it's really beautiful. But if you look at that, I mean, you're right. I do see things from different perspectives, or from both sides, because on one hand, I see it as, you know, an Egyptian American, as someone who's lived in the region, who is very, you know, intimately familiar with the region and its people, while at the same time having spent all this time, you know, as a U.S. policymaker, basically, or an advisor, and to senior policymakers. And so, you know, my Jasmine, the person, you know, says this is such a no-brainer. I mean, these people are literally protesting for every single value that the West holds near and dear, and I mean, that is always telling. You can't get closer. I mean, so you know, and that's not just in Lebanon. So let's take it to Iraq. Sure. I mean, the Iraqi protesters, how brave those young Iraqis were, and how they were literally, you know, even more so, you know, in Lebanon, there were incidents of tear gassing and things like that. In Iraq, you know, these kids were going out into the street not knowing whether they were going to come back home.
Absolutely.
And they were doing that because they believed in things that the U.S. has stood for, or at least proclaimed to stand for.
Yeah.
For forever. And you know, and I'm talking about European countries as well. And so on one hand, you kind of see that, and it's only then when you realize the extent to which the region has been dehumanized that people and policymakers in the West, I think there are two kinds. One I understand more than the other. The one that I understand more is, well, what do we do? What do we do? We don't want to get involved. We don't want to do regime change anymore. You know, it has never worked out for us in the past. You know, we always do it wrong. We don't understand these contexts. We always pick the wrong side. You know, And in the case of Lebanon, for example, it's like, well, who's the leader? Who do we work with? Who do we support? You know, who's gonna run the country the day after? I mean, it's all you know, fine and dandy. They're playing amazing patriotic songs, but how do they govern? And those are actually real questions, and they're valid questions. So for people who are protesting in the Middle East, if I were advising them, I would say you need to chart a very clear path and a very clear agenda and roadmap for how you intend to achieve what you're trying to achieve. and be very explicit about whether you want support from outside or not, because some don't. Some countries don't. Some will say, leave us alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just leave us alone. Let us do, stay out of it.
Yeah.
So that's the one valid sort of concern that I have. It's like, okay, if you're a US policymaker, a British policymaker, and if you don't understand what comes the day after, you're not going to do anything one way or the other. It's too risky. So you just kind of let them do whatever they're doing.
Right.
The other type of policymaker I think out there is the part that sort of shakes their head. It's Donald Trump calling Syria the land of sand and blood or whatever. It's the type of policymaker that really looks at the region from a very dehumanizing perspective, does not actually see them as having the same aspirations or values that they do, kind of seeing them as like lesser than. These people have always fought each other. I think one of Obama's advisors called it ancient hatreds, which is just such a ridiculous thing to say.
Of course.
And the thing that as again, and you'll understand this, and your listeners who are bicultural will understand this, as someone who kind of straddles both worlds, I find it really heartbreaking that we're not able to bridge that communication gap between the two, because you can see perfectly clearly how similar the two are, the same, they're fighting for the same values, even if it's not the same culture or religion.
Absolutely.
We're talking about basic values of human rights, dignity, respect, family. I mean, these are basic common human values. And
Absolutely.
so the fact that I think Western policymakers, or at least some of them, or even just the West in general, it's always kind of boggled my mind how little, for example, the US public in general has cared about Syria, the refugee crisis and the chemical weapons attacks. And I always wonder if it had been another country that was, white or Christian or, whatever, would it have been different? And I don't want to come to any conclusions, but it's hard not to feel that way. It's hard not to feel that through, a couple of decades of conflict and war and loss and trauma on both sides, it's hard not to just come to the conclusion that, each side wants nothing to do with the other now. But I do believe that it's to the detriment of both of them.
And I think what you said about not knowing who to talk to and whether or not they want us to talk anyway is a real question. And without that answer, it's sort of a reckless journey to try to sort of get involved and maybe end up with a worse situation. But is there something about the fluidity, it seems to be necessary, at least among those countries when it comes to trying to achieve some form of regime change, or forget change, just reform, that the fluidity is a byproduct of violence. It's a byproduct as well of assassinations. And there's, I think, many reasons why protesters have avoided sort of nominating one person. And I think that is part of it as well, that they just don't want to get targeted. So that's a component that seems to be required for reform there. And then at the same time, that prevents organization. Organization in terms of having a structure to communicate with. And at least in the case of Lebanon in 2005, which is a sort of an interesting evolution for the last 15 years, that these were the political parties that were, in a way, you could have the U.S. speak to the leadership of several political parties in Lebanon, and that became sort of the channel of communication. Now you have protesters that are calling on those parties to get lost as well. So it's really a matter of who do you talk to? Is there a way to kind of bridge that so that the Americans are at least in principle on the side of the protesters? And like you said, if you organize enough, or if you ever need us to be behind you in at least a symbolic way, we're there. Or is that also not in the mix today, at least when it comes to the Trump administration? And in a way, what you said earlier is that, this dismissal, blood and sand, doesn't matter whether they look like us or not, lost cause. And this whole reference about they don't look white enough or they're not Christian. Going to the Lebanese example, I mean, you can't get whiter and more Christian, at least when it comes to the Middle East. This is
Right,
the
right. I mean, if there's any if there's any country that will elicit sympathy.
Are there more Christians anywhere else in the Middle East? No. Can you
Right,
get whiter? I don't think so. And also you have women front and center. I mean,
right.
it's a woman-led thing. Even that is sort of it's not for us. So I guess
I just
looking at
think,
it, how much is, I'm trying to get sort of between that personality and policy and whether or not there's something that could stick given what we have today.
so it's a difficult question to answer because there are just so many factors involved and there are so many moving parts. And I think, maybe I'll just kind of, I mention a couple of parts just thinking out loud here. The one, I think every US government, every US administration comes in with a strategy for every region in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Every US they do this, this, like they do this during the campaigns, they have policy papers, the candidates have policy papers, they have their platforms, and then once they get into office, they have their national security strategy, they have their Middle East policy. So in that sense, that's always been the area where the biggest changes could happen. So like, let's say, for example, as we discussed, the Bush administration, democracy promotion was way, way up there. The Obama administration, not so much. It was kind of more behind the scenes. The Trump administration, ISIS and Iran, that's it, like done. That's the only thing, actually the three I's, I would say, like Iran, ISIS and Israel. Like those are the three priorities of the Trump administration when it comes to the Middle East.
Right.
And when you have a US president setting his priorities, it's the one thing that I always used to kind of notice as a staffer at the Pentagon, for example. So we would have, policy makers, foreign officials, coming in from different countries. They would meet with my boss, the Secretary of Defense, and they would ask for things. Of course, we were the Pentagon, so it was very much, we would like this, we would like that,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it always struck me as, and you can apply this to protesters as well. If you're asking something of let's say of the US as an example, well, I think it's really important to take stock of what the US priorities are at that time, just so that you can see where you can, like, where is that box that you're working within.
Yes,
and
yes,
I
yes.
think that, you know what I mean? And that box will look different for every president.
Mm-hmm.
I personally don't see an era in the future where we're going to go back to huge US involvement in the region. I don't think so.
Right.
We wouldn't see a huge shift towards the Middle East in terms of more involvement. Like, that era has passed, and it's passed because of so many different things. The economy, the US is struggling itself. There are other priorities, So if you are a protester in Lebanon, for example, or in any other country, or if you're a political party, or if you're a government, leadership of the country, and you want something specific out of the US or the West, however you want to put it, you have to be able to understand what your limitations are in terms of what you can ask for. And the reason I say that is not because I don't want protesters to get what they're after. Of course, I believe in the values that they're fighting for, but I'm trying to be very pragmatic. My experience in government shaped me in a way that I am much more pragmatic in my policy recommendations than I am as a human being in terms of what I want to see.
Right.
And there are certain things that are just never going to happen again when it comes to the US and the Middle East. And so where do we go from there? Like, what's the reset? What's the new relationship? Is it you try to forge relationships between people? So like, as a Lebanese protester, do I try to bypass the national level government and try to talk straight to the American people through talk shows and podcasts and op-eds and cultural, exchanges, and then hope that trickles up somehow? Or do you try to just go straight up to the top and ask for things? And those are things that those protesters across the region, if they want any support at all from the outside, those are questions that they should be asking themselves. Those are things that they need to be thinking through strategically. What is it that we want to achieve? How do we go about achieving it? What is in the realm of possible? And what is the best way to go about that?
I want to pick your brain on this. You hinted at it earlier that the Pentagon, to a degree, there's a consistency, despite the administration, of supporting the security apparatus, at least, in certain relationships, even if it may not be to the benefit of protesters on the ground. And that seems to be a continuous sort of trend within the last 3 administrations. You can correct me here if I'm getting this wrong. That there are some things that do not change, and if they change, it's cosmetic more than instrumental. And that's when it comes to the security component. So I'll throw an example towards you. I don't get the feeling from the American side that there's any sincere thought today of not supporting the Lebanese army. You may
not supporting.
In other words, sometimes you feel like you hear whispers of sort of maybe second guessing or some thoughts against it, but by and large, that relationship stays intact. And if it's delayed for a small, brief period of time, and then the money gets there. That's just one example of protesters trying to seek reform and regime change, quote unquote. But there's a sort of continuity in American policy, at least state to state. And you can sort of do examples other than Lebanon as well. Is there a continuity when it comes to supporting protesters? And what I'm really getting at is, does the State Department, each administration, shift to the degree that it's really a blank slate each time at how you look at a protest movement? Or is there also continuity, at least in the smallest sense, which is, if you call on us, if you want us there for you, we will be there, but you need to be organized. Is organization the missing component, that you have to take the risk against the odds, organize, and then if you call on us, whether it's Trump or Biden or Obama or Bush, we'll help you?
So it depends to a certain, so, the State Department and the Defense Department all operate under the president's policy and his strategy. So you can't have a president that, doesn't want to get involved, for example, in Syria, and then have his Secretary of State get involved in Syria somehow. So again, like the operating space is very narrow. It's it narrowly fits under the U.S. president, and his NSC, his National Security Council. The policy that comes out of the White House is the policy that, and those decisions can be hashed out. That's what you have cabinet meetings for, and you have, principals committee meetings, for example, which is where all the principals, the heads of the different departments meet, where they will have those discussions, where the State Department could say, look, I know that, we're not going to do X, Y, and Z in Syria, but I would like my team to meet with the opposition and provide them with this certain amount of assistance. And there's, it's a discussion. And then, of course, it all has to be approved by the White House. And then it happens. So it has a lot to do with personality. If you compare, for example, Secretary Kerry, when John Kerry was Secretary of State, he was very involved. He was very empathetic. He was very much on the side of, kind of people fighting for their dignity. And he was very much, the peacemaker, the negotiator. And so he was always pushing for that kind of stuff. And sometimes he won, sometimes he didn't, when in these bureaucratic battles. So again, I always hate to say in podcasts or interviews, like, oh, it depends, because it's such a vague thing. But I think the most tangible thing to come out of conversations like these, or what I try to do, is I try to give from my experience, here's what I think works, here's what doesn't work, here's why this is happening. And I think that, in terms of why it's happening, we've talked about it, there's just extreme fatigue on both sides, extreme trauma on both sides.
Yes.
and a sense of dehumanization on both sides. And there is no great communicator. There's no, person or organization, or, it's very much ad hoc. I mean, you have, brilliant writers out there that do their part in building bridges, but there's no kind of decision at the very top by some
Yes.
of these countries to build bridges between East and West in that way, or the Middle East and the US in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, think of Obama's speech in Cairo,
I
like
was when you when
where
yeah,
is that?
absolutely.
Where is that type of rhetoric? I was struck by, if you go back and you compare President Obama's 2009 Cairo speech, how personal and how empathetic that was, and you go to President Trump's speech in Saudi Arabia, which I think was his first trip abroad as president. You can see, especially as someone who's really into kind of communication and the nuances of
Mm,
words and things like that, the way that the difference between the two tones, where one was, was talking to people as, as an equal. Let's build this relationship. Let's
mm,
start fresh. Let's start, regardless of what happened afterwards. But at
mm.
that moment in time,
Yes.
there was someone who was attempting to build bridges between the two cultures. And if you look at President Trump's speech, and again, really, this isn't political. I mean, I'm not, we can joke about that stuff, but as I analyze this, it's really not political at all. But the way that President Trump was speaking in Saudi Arabia was very much in a sort of, they are the other. I want you
Yes.
guys to deal with those terrorists that are in your land, that come from your faith. It's just the nuances that I think, even if people don't get them explicitly, it has a sort of subliminal effect that is accentuated with, of course, actions, not just words. But so I think that, we really do, if we are going to move to a space moving forward where there's some kind of reset between the United States, the Middle East, although that sounds very general, but just to generalize, um, you have to have a couple of things. One thing is that you have to have a leader, um, leaders
Yeah.
of these nations who will come out and set the tone for the relationship, and set
Right.
the tone for
Yeah.
that, that level of respect and humanity and equality and all of that stuff, from sort of more of a grassroots perspective or point of view, as as protesters in the region are trying to communicate with the West, with the US. Really think about what you're trying to communicate, how you're communicating it, and where is that operating space that you have, where you're
Mm,
not asking for something
mm.
so off the table that everything else that you ask for is going to be dismissed as well, you know but at the same time still be able to kind of get a little bit of what you want. It requires strategy on the
Mm.
part of both parties. And just because, if you're a protest movement, even if you don't have a leader, you should still have a strategy for
Yes.
how you're going to get to where you want and who plays what role in your
Right.
journey.
So it's almost like an instruction manual for the last stage of development. So you
Right.
have a protest movement that does all the difficult work and gets to a point where they're able to do in a way, what you're suggesting, which is limited window, you can put yourself in there and then hope for the best. It's a painful process. And
Yeah,
I,
of
and
course.
actually, this is kind of what I wanted to wrap it up with, a question, and this, I don't mean to be hard on the protesters or anything like that. Actually, I'm looking at it in the other way. The fact that there is no one coming to the rescue of these protesters, and in a way, their legitimate concerns are shared. They're universal, but looking at it sort of as a population that's left to its own, and they're fighting from within, and these are domestic concerns.
Hmm.
Is there something positive there, that you're on your own, and if you do it, great, because you'll get there on your own? If you don't get there on your own, you'll have to try again.
Right.
So is that in a way a hopeful way of looking at what are domestic concerns for the moment? That you don't necessarily need the external support. Don't count on it. Do the dirty work. Get there on your own. And one day you might actually get there.
I think it is more genuine and long-lasting if you get there on your own, right? I mean, when you have like a very organic movement that that takes the time to build and plan and strategize, and to do it without outside help or an outside push, you know, of course that it's more legitimate, it's more tangible, it's more, you know, you take a lot of pride in it. It's something, but you know, again, I just feel like at the end of the day, Ronnie, you have the Middle East. You know, it's almost tragic. I mean, it's a bunch of countries that are just kind of stuck where, you know, outside interests are never going to disappear when it comes to, and I don't know if I'm putting this in the right way, but you know, you have issues like terrorism, you have issues like maritime security, you know, the free flow of oil, the protection of Israel. I mean, you have all of these issues that just, you know, time and time again surpass.
And it should be
many of these issues that we're talking about.
Yes.
So at the end of the day, you know, would things be very different if, you know, the Middle East wasn't the focal point of a lot of these issues that are considered to be national security interests of the great powers? Would they have been able to do things more on their own? Would they have been able to have a bit more breathing space? I mean, I grew up in Egypt. You know, one of the things that I always tell my friends in the US, and I would even say this to my colleagues at the Pentagon, you don't know what it feels like to not be in control of your own destiny. You don't know what it feels like. I mean, Lebanon knows more than anybody almost what this feels like, you know, when you have outside powers interfering in your affairs, when you wake up and you just don't know what's going to happen because some other country is going to make a decision about what's going to happen to you, when you're going to wake up one day and you're going to see foreign tanks rolling down your streets that you didn't invite into your country. Absolutely. I mean, you know, Americans have no idea what that feels like. And when I try to kind of explain it to them in these very stark terms, what would you do, you know, my American colleague, if China suddenly sent tanks over and said, we're taking over, you know, Washington, D.C., and you would pick up arms too. You would do, you know, I mean, America's a revolutionary country. So again, this all comes back to humanization and communication and just seeing each other as not just people who are fighting for the same values, but people who also have the same fears, the same traumas, and the same natural human instinct for self-protection and for the protection of our loved ones.
Yeah, absolutely. There are difficult issues that are there. They face this generation, they face previous generations as well. Unfortunately, coronavirus has sort of robbed us of the momentum that we saw the last few months. And hopefully, as this sort of diminishes, we'll see the aspirations continue in one form or another.
Absolutely. And I just, you know, kind of just come back to the point that I made earlier, which is, you know, if I were in these government's shoes, I would take this time to come up with a plan for the day after.
Yes.
Having recognized that you are not going to quash these people's hopes and dreams forever. It will keep coming up until you give them some semblance of dignity and hope. And if you don't, it's going to keep coming up. So, you know, take this time to do something about it, you know.
I want to say thank you for a few things. Number one, you're doing this at, I believe it's now 1 a.m. Istanbul time.
Yes.
So you're very kind with your time. You're very generous with your time. Number two, in the middle of coronavirus and all the concerns we have for loved ones, you took an hour of your time to do this as well. That's very important for me. And number 3, which I think is the most flattering, even though this will be on audio, you did it video with me. So we were stuck with each other. And that is a very important thing during social distancing. We actually we looked at each other for an hour as well, which makes it even more rewarding.
So we have to take human contact where we can get it nowadays. So
absolutely.
I was more than happy to do it on video.
Absolutely. Well said. So Jasmine,
thank you so much, Ronnie.